Alexander Franklin James was born on January 10, 1843, in Clay County, Missouri, to Robert and Zerelda James. He was the oldest of 3 children. Frank was described as about 5 feet 8 inches in height, heavy built, full in face, hair, and complexion. His father was a Baptist minister, starting 3 churches in Clay County, all of which are still conducting services today. Brought up in a religious family, neither he nor his brother Jesse were ever known to drink. "A man's a fool to drink," he said. "It takes away his money and his brains and does him no good in any way." Frank was reported to have never cursed or used a vulgar word or talked on a subject not suitable for a mixed crowd. The James family never owned slaves, but during the Civil War the family was outspoken regarding their Southern sympathies. Frank James was 18 years old when he enlisted in the Confederate Army at Centerville, Missouri on May 4, 1861. After fighting the initial battles of Wilson's Creek and Lexington, Missouri, Frank returned home where he was arrested and forced to take the oath of federal loyalty and to furnish a bond of $1,000. Arrested a second time and placed in jail in Liberty, Missouri by Colonel William Pennick for being too outspoken in his Southern loyalties, he escaped and joined guerrilla leader Colonel William R. Quantrill. When the Federals discovered that Frank was riding with Quantrill, they rode to the James farm looking for Frank. The Yankees then arrested his mother and kept her in jail for 25 days for feeding Frank and his friends. Guerrilla Andrew Walker recalled seeing Frank James for the first time. He was a blue-eyed, boyish, beardless stripling of 18 or 19. When he was with the guerrillas, Frank was described as a serious and straightforward. Frank was always a precocious reader, carrying copies of the classics in his saddlebags, and was known to often quote from the works of Shakespeare. Although Frank had been active in minor guerrilla activity north of the river, riding with Quantrill, he now faced a larger federal force stationed in Jackson County, Missouri. Frank remembered the day he joined the guerrilla company. "I'll never forget the first time I saw Quantrill. He was nearly 6 feet in height, rather thin. His hair and mustache was sandy, and he was full of life and a jolly fellow. He had none of the air of the bravado or the desperado about him. We all loved him at first sight, and every man under his command was tried and true. He was a demon in battle and did not know what it was to be afraid." Frank's brother Jesse was only 14 years old when the war began. While plowing in a cornfield behind his home in late May 1863, Jesse was suddenly surrounded by a federal patrol. Because he refused to disclose any information about his brother or Quantrill's camp, the soldiers whipped him and left him bleeding in the field. When he returned to his house, he found his stepfather, Dr. Reuben Samuels, hanging from a tree and his mother desperately trying to cut him down. Finding life unbearable at home, Jesse left home and joined Quantrill's company. Time and time again, federal soldiers rode to Frank's home, one time taking his mother, sister, aunt, and cousin, stripping them to the waist, then tied them to trees and took a blacksnake whip and beat them before riding away, leaving the women and girls to be cut down and carried into the house by neighbors. The abuse of Frank's mother, who was pregnant at the time, caused her to miscarry. Frank fought in most of the battles along the Missouri-Kansas border while with Quantrill. One of the most hard-fought battles was the Battle of the Ravines near Pleasant Hill, Missouri. There were 200 Federals fighting 40 of Quantrill's guerrillas. After 2 hours, both sides' ammunition was exhausted, and the men were reduced to hand-to-hand fighting with clubbed rifles and rocks for weapons. Many thought that Quantrill was reckless, but Frank said that every man was brave and had absolute confidence in the gallant leader. Frank cut his way through on foot until he found a nearby farm where he found a horse and saddle and rejoined his comrades. During the winter of 1862, Frank went south with the guerrillas into Arkansas, where they saw heavy action at the battles of Cane Hill and Prairie Grove. Their most notable experience came about when Frank and Jesse was pursuing an enemy patrol when it came across General Joe Shelby as he was being surrounded by the enemy. Although the guerrillas had only a few men in their force, they stormed the Union position and scattered the enemy, enabling Shelby to escape. Shelby was forever indebted to Quantrill's men for their outstanding show of bravery. Years after the war, Shelby volunteered to act as a character witness at Frank James's trial. Another display of Frank's bravery took place at the Westport skirmish on June 17, 1863. The guerrillas lay in ambush until a Federal patrol passed by. When the Federals came in range, guerrilla Fletcher Taylor and his best friend Boone Shoal made the charge together. Shoal was the first man to fall. Frank shot the soldier that killed Shoal. Also mortally wounded was Captain Fernando Scott as he was chasing the Federals from the field. A few short weeks later, Frank was riding in the van of 400 guerrillas as they descended on Lawrence, Kansas in the most memorable raid of the war. The guerrillas left the town in ashes, and the streets were strewn with jayhawkers and redlegs who would no longer commit atrocities against their Missouri neighbors. During the summer of 1864, troops of the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, commanded by Colonel James H. Ford, were stationed in Independence, Missouri. By this time, Frank was riding under Captain George Todd, Quantrill's second in command. The guerrillas lured the Federals out of their garrison by cutting the telegraph wires and waited for a Federal patrol to come investigate. The guerrillas took up position in the woods opposite the Moore farm and waited. Just down the road was an open field in the half-mile-wide valley of the Little Blue. The Colorado Cavalry, numbering about 42 men under the command of Captain Seymour Wagner, charged the waiting guerrillas. The Coloradoans were credited with fighting fearlessly and desperately, but without effect. They had shot their pistols too low, which resulted in only wounding 3 guerrillas, Ike Flannery, Henry Porter, and Warren Welch. When the ghastly toll was taken, 37 Federals lay dead on the field, including Captain Wagner. The rest retreated back towards Independence, with guerrillas Dick Kinney, Frank James, and Ike Flannery in hot pursuit. Frank James chased the enemy within sight of Independence, killing his 4th man within 50 steps of the picket post. After the Wagner fight, Frank joined Captain Bill Anderson's company north of the Missouri River. Anderson led his company into Fayette, followed by other guerrilla companies led by George Todd, Dave Poole, Thomas Todd, Caleb Perkins, and Quantrill. The Federals were lodged behind the safety of the brick walls of the courthouse. In the assault, guerrilla Oliver Johnson was shot and lay mortally wounded. Frank James managed to get Johnson onto a blanket and carried to safety. Recalling the fight, Frank James said, "I was mightily scared. It was the worst fight I ever had." After Fayette, the guerrillas rested their men and horses outside Centralia, Missouri. Major A.V.E. Johnson and 125 soldiers of the 39th Missouri Militia got word of their presence and rode out to exterminate Anderson's command. We dismounted to tighten the belts on the horses, and then at the word of command started on our charge. When Anderson's men came within range, Johnson gave the order to fire, believing his long-range rifles would do much damage. Frank James reported that the guerrillas were lying low on their horses, a trick learned from Comanches that had saved their lives many times. Frank said, "For a moment we moved slowly. Our line was nearly a quarter of a mile long, theirs much closer together. We were still some 600 yards away, our speed increasing and our ranks closing up." James reported that Frank Shepard was riding next to him on his right, and Shepard was struck in the head. The guerrillas spurred their horses into a dead run, trying to catch the Federals before they could reload and fire another volley. "We couldn't stop in that terrible charge for anything," said Frank. Up the hill we went, yelling like wild Indians. Such shrieks you will never hear as broke the stillness of that September afternoon. On we went up the hill. Almost in the twinkling of an eye, we were on the Yankee line. They seemed terrorized. Some of the Yankees were at fixed bayonets. Some were biting off their cartridges, preparing to reload. Yelling, shooting our pistols upon them we went. The tremendous impetus of horses at full speed broke through and scattered their line like chaff before the wind. The guerrillas dug their spurs into their mounts just before they reached the Federal line. The horses, worked up to a frenzy during the charge, made an impregnable solid mass of flesh, which when they struck the Federal line knocked most of the terrified soldiers down. The guerrillas then wheeled their horses and made another pass, this time with pistols and unerring shots. Not a single man of the line escaped. Guerrilla Harrison Troe remembered that probably 60 of Johnson's command gained their horses before the fierce wave of the charge broke over them, and these were pursued by himself and 4 other guerrillas: Ben Morrill, Frank James, Peyton Long, and Archie Clement. Frank James managed to overtake and kill 11 Federals. Frank later claimed that it was his brother Jesse that killed Major Johnson. The guerrillas then joined up with General Sterling Price and served as scouts as he had made his assault westward towards Kansas City. Price eventually suffered a defeat south of Kansas City at the Battle of Westport, which became known as the Gettysburg of the West. After Westport, Quantrill handpicked 42 of his best men and led them into Kentucky. A few weeks after General Robert E. Lee's surrender on April 9th, a Federal patrol ran upon Quantrill and a detachment of his men hiding in a barn in Spencer County, Kentucky. Quantrill was mortally wounded. During the night, Frank James, John Ross, and William Halse arrived at Quantrill's side and bid him farewell. Henry Porter gathered Frank James and the remnant of Quantrill's band and surrendered at Samuel's Depot in Nelson County on July 25, 1865. Frank, at first, was not permitted to return to Missouri. When he did finally return home, he was challenged by 4 Federal vigilantes, and during the provocation, Frank killed 2 of the soldiers instantly. The 3rd was wounded, while the 4th managed to shoot Frank in the hip, causing a grievous injury. Friends carried him into hiding and summoned a doctor who saved his life. On February 18, 1867, 5 Federal militiamen rode to the James farm looking for the former guerrillas. Jesse was the only brother at home. The soldiers came to kill, but after Jesse threw open the front door, 2 Federals lay dying, 2 were seriously wounded, and only 1 managed to escape unharmed. With this act, Frank and Jesse were forced to take to the bush as outlaws. The brothers were on the outlaw trail for the next 15 years. Federal vigilantes, in the guise of a detective agency, descended on the James farm looking for the James boys. One threw a bomb through the window of the sleeping residents inside. The only occupants at home was Zerelda Samuels and her young son, Archie Peyton Samuels. The explosion tore off the right arm of Mrs. Samuels and killed the young Archie. With this brutal act, sympathy for the former guerrillas grew increasingly. With the assassination of Jesse James in 1882, Frank James surrendered to the authorities. Afterward, Frank was brought to trial but never convicted. He was kept in jail in Independence. He was perceived by the Missouri public as a hero and received his own cell as well as special treatment. Records state that his cell was fitted with a carpet and a rocking chair, and that the cell door was never locked. Each day, hundreds of visitors would come by to visit and pay their respects. Frank was transferred to Gallatin, Missouri to face another trial when he wrote Fletcher Taylor to come help him. He was later acquitted of all crimes. This finally afforded him an opportunity to settle down to a life of peace. He went to Oklahoma to live on a farm with his mother. Whenever Frank visited his old friends in Kentucky, he often taught Sunday school at the New Salem Baptist Church just north of Samuel's Depot. In the last 30 years of his life, James worked a variety of jobs, including a shoe salesman and then as a theater ticket taker in St. Louis. Frank took up the lecture circuit while residing in Sherman, Texas. He also took the time to visit old friends like Fletcher Taylor and posing for a photograph in front of Taylor's boarding house in Colorado. In 1902, James was hired as the betting commissioner at the Fairgrounds racetrack in New Orleans. He was also part of a Chicago investment group which purchased Buckskin Bill's Wild West show. Starting in 1898, Frank was the main attraction when large-scale Quantrill reunions were held each August in Jackson County. During the reunions, each guerrilla wore an elegant ribbon and buttons showing their former leader's name and picture. President Harry S. Truman even attended some reunions with the observation, "Quantrill and his men were no more bandits than the men on the other side." I've been to reunions of Quantrill's men 2 or 3 times. All they were trying to do was protect the property of the Missouri side of the line. In his final years, James returned to the James farm, giving tours for the sum of 50 cents. Frank James died at his boyhood home on February 18, 1915, at the age of 72. He left behind his wife Annie Ralston James and one son. Frank James feared that after his death, someone would steal his body, so he requested that he and his wife be cremated rather than buried. His ashes were then interred in a small plot in Independence, Missouri, on land that saw the first battle between Union and Confederate forces, the Battle of Rock Creek, situated halfway between Kansas City and Independence. Here in death lies Frank James, who in his lifetime fought for what he believed in, never deserted a friend, and never backed down from a fight. Certainly no other American has had so much written about them. At his best, which is how he deserves to be remembered, his life story has provided us a legend which spans more than a century. It started in a beautiful Clay County, Missouri countryside in the year 1843, followed him serving the colors of a Confederate brotherhood, and through the desperate times of Reconstruction, to the final blowing of the taps.